The Appalachian ridges of Raven Hollow rise like ancient guardians, their forests dense enough to swallow secrets for generations. In the winter of 1923, snow sealed off the hollow from the rest of McDowell County. At the very end of a rutted road where wagons rarely passed and coal dust hung heavy in the air, stood the cabin of Silas Whitlow. Widowed young Silas was left to raise his daughter Lila alone. To outsiders, he was merely a gaunt man with a hard jaw and the kind of eyes that seemed to pierce through you. But those who lived nearby whispered that something about the Whitlows had always been off. For months at a time, no visitor climbed that mountain. The pastor managed a yearly call in the summer, but otherwise the Whitlows lived in near complete solitude. In such silence, habits take root and boundaries blur. It was here, in this crucible of isolation, that a tragedy would unfold, one not born overnight, but woven patiently into the fabric of daily life. When the first child arrived in 1938, summoned by rain-soaked lantern light and the reluctant hands of a traveling doctor, what should have been a moment of new life became the beginning of a nightmare. The infant survived only 3 days, her face marked with features that made the doctor lower his eyes and scribble uneasily into his diary. What was hidden in the cabin was darker than most dared imagine, a truth so disturbing that the town would spend decades trying not to see it. Before we step fully into this story, I invite you pause for a moment. Share in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. In this way, we remind ourselves that we are connected, even as we descend into the tale of a family who was utterly alone. The valley where the Whitlow family lived was beautiful in the way that only remote places can be. From the crest of Raven Hollow, the forest stretched like a sea of dark pines, broken only by thin columns of smoke from cabins scattered across the slopes. In summer, birdsong filled the air, and wildflowers clung to every edge of rock. But winter was another story. The snow came early and lingered late, turning roads into rivers of ice. By November, the Whitlow cabin was a fortress of wood and stone cut off from the town below until the thaw returned in March. Isolation was not a choice here, it was a fact of survival. Silas Whitlow, tall and angular, had been a teamster for the coal company before an accident crushed his leg in 1915. He walked with a limp that slowed him, but his reputation for stubborn endurance was unshaken. After his wife Margaret died in childbirth in 1917, he became both father and mother to their only surviving child, Lila. Neighbors occasionally saw the pair together in the summer when the road was passable, yet even then there was something strange about the way they moved. Lila never strayed more than a few steps behind him. She spoke little, her arms often folded tight across her chest. It was as though she lived in the shadow of her father's presence rather than beside it. For years, no one interfered. This was Appalachia during the early 20th century, hard, insular, and suspicious of outsiders. Families married within families to keep their land, their coal rights, or simply because the world beyond the ridges was too far away. Cousins sometimes wed, and uncles occasionally took in nieces as wives when survival demanded it. Yet even here, in a land of blurred lines, some boundaries were bright and absolute. A father and daughter, this was a taboo that sat like a poison in the communal well. People whispered, but no one acted. In Raven Hollow, silence was as thick as the snow. The silence fractured in June 1938 when rain pounded the tin roof of the Whitlow cabin. That night, lantern light flickered through the cracks in the shutters as Dr. Andrew Keats, the region's lone physician, climbed the muddy path with his medical bag clutched tight. He had been summoned in desperation by Silas himself. A rare thing, for the patriarch was known to distrust doctors, ministers, and anyone who might pry too closely into his private affairs. Inside the cabin, the scene was grim. Lila, pale and gaunt at only 20 years old, writhed on the bed as labor overtook her. Dr. Keats had seen many deliveries in rough conditions, but what awaited him here unsettled him in ways he would never fully confess. Hours later, after a brutal struggle, a baby girl was delivered, but her life was measured in days, not years. She bore extra fingers, curled like claws, her jaw underdeveloped, and her tiny chest labored with every breath. She died on the 3rd day, swaddled in rags, her mother too weak to speak, her father sitting stone-faced in the corner. What chilled Dr. Keats was not only the child's deformities, though they were striking, but Silas's reaction. The doctor later wrote in his diary, "I have seen grandfathers mourn, but never like this." He held the infant as though she were his daughter, not his granddaughter. His tears were raw, unguarded, the grief of a parent rather than an elder. The words haunted him. He would never show those notes to the townsfolk, but the unease in his eyes was clear when he returned to town. Silas explained the situation in only a few clipped words. "My daughter was expecting. The Lord giveth and the Lord taketh." He purchased baby clothes at the general store weeks earlier, and now with no baby to show, the whispers grew louder. Who had fathered Lila's child? No man had courted her. No suitor had climbed the mountain to call. The people of McDowell County were not naive. Rumors spread and they grew darker with every retelling. Yet still no one acted. In part it was fear. Silas Whitlow was a man of few words but unmistakable presence, and those blue eyes of his had a way of ending conversations before they began. In part it was resignation. Out here survival often meant looking the other way. And in part it was guilt. Everyone knew the valley's isolation could warp a family tree, that poverty and geography pressed people into unions that city folk would never imagine. To acknowledge the Whitlow story too directly was to acknowledge the shadows in their own bloodlines. To understand what was happening inside the Whitlow cabin, one must also understand the broader context. By the 1932nd Appalachia was already a region abandoned by prosperity. Coal towns rose and fell like breaths, leaving behind unemployed miners, widows and orphans. Company stores bound families in debt, and the Great Depression tightened the noose further. Education was scarce, healthcare scarcer. Isolation was not only geographical, it was social, economic, spiritual. Families like the Whitlows lived in worlds of their own making, with few outside eyes to hold them accountable. Genetic science at the time was primitive, but even then physicians recognized patterns. Children born of close-kin unions often carried physical and cognitive burdens. Heart defects, extra digits, and cranial abnormalities were all documented outcomes, though rarely spoken of in public. In urban centers, eugenicists twisted these facts into cruel policies. In the mountains, people spoke of bad blood or the family curse. The Whitlows, it seemed, had inherited both the geography of isolation and the genetic consequences of its silence. When spring came in 1939, the Whitlow cabin remained shuttered. Lila did not appear in town. Silas came alone for supplies, speaking less than ever. The townsfolk, eager to return to their own struggles, let the matter fade into background gossip. But those who remembered the baby's burial behind the cabin, the crude wooden cross barely visible through weeds, could not forget. In the mountains, graves had a way of keeping their secrets, but the earth-like memory never swallowed everything completely. Thus began the long season of silence in Raven Hollow, a silence broken only by the sound of the creek in Thor and the occasional toll of a church bell from 10 miles away. Inside the cabin, the cycle was beginning again, though the town below would not fully realize it until years later. What had been suspected was becoming truth, and the truth was darker than most dared name aloud. The winter of 1939 was fierce, but when the thaw finally came, the people of Raven Hollow noticed something unusual. Silas Whitlow came to town alone, buying more provisions than usual, flour, sugar, and candles in bulk. There was no sign of Lila, and questions were met with his stony silence. Then, in early summer, word spread quietly: Lila had given birth again. This time, the child survived. The boy was named Eli, though many would later call him the Quiet One. From the start, his body bore visible differences. His head was abnormally large, the skin stretched taut as if his skull carried too much water. One eye shone blue, cold and sharp like his father's, the other brown and soft, unmistakably his mother's. His fingers were fused together, forming almost a claw-like shape. The midwife, Eunice Pruitt, who was summoned at the last moment, remembered the scene vividly decades later. That cabin smelled wrong. Not dirt or wood smoke, something like an animal caught in a trap. Desperation has its own scent, and it clung to everything in that house. The prognosis was grim. Eunice whispered to Silas, "This boy won't survive the winter." But she was wrong. Against all odds, Eli lived not just through the cold, but through the next 5 years. He never spoke more than a few broken words, and he walked with unsteady steps. Yet Lila carried him everywhere, her arms straining under his weight, as though she believed sheer willpower could protect him from the fate written into his body. For Lila, Eli's survival was both miracle and curse-proof that her children could endure, and proof of the legacy she was powerless to escape. By 1942, another child had come, this time a girl, Ruthie. Her features were less visibly marked, her limbs straighter, her face more symmetrical. For a moment Lila dared to hope, but as Ruthie grew, her mind lagged behind. She struggled to form sentences, often speaking in fragments. She found comfort in repetitive tasks, folding cloth, arranging stones in patterns outside the cabin, but even neighbors who caught rare glimpses could see she would never be fully independent. Still, Ruthie was love. Lila's devotion to her children was fierce, almost defiant. She sewed small dresses from old flour sacks, patched with care. She hummed mountain lullabies in a low voice, rocking them near the hearth. To the outside world, the Whitlows remained a shadowy family at the edge of the county, but within the cabin the children were everything to Lila. Love does not vanish simply because it is entangled with tragedy. Tragedy, however, was relentless. In 1944, a fourth pregnancy ended in heartbreak when a stillborn boy was delivered. He was buried quietly behind the cabin, with the first daughter, 2 small graves marked only by wooden crosses that leaned in the wind. By now, even the people of town began to keep count. Too many infants, too many burials, too many unanswered questions, and yet still no one intervened. It is important to pause here and understand the science that was only beginning to surface during these years. By the mid-20th century, physicians in larger cities had begun to note the devastating effects of close-kin unions. In isolated populations, recessive genes, normally harmless when diluted, could double up, producing serious congenital defects. Hydrocephalus, polydactyly fused digits, congenital heart disease, these were the whispered consequences of bad blood. But in rural Appalachia, families rarely had access to such explanations. Instead, they spoke of curses, sins of the fathers, or simply God's will. The Whitlow children embodied all of these whispered fears. By 1945, Eli had lived long enough to defy every prediction, yet his survival was not without cost. His fragile body could not withstand harsh winters. That year, pneumonia came down the valley like a shadow. Eli, 6 years old, succumbed within days. Lila wept over his body, holding him as if she could breathe life back into him. Neighbors who attended the small burial noted her haunted face, her exhaustion, the way her hands trembled as she shoveled earth onto the grave herself. The funeral revealed something else as well. Lila was pregnant again. Her belly just beginning to swell beneath her faded dress was impossible to ignore. The whispers in town grew sharper. If Silas was not Eli's father then, who no man had courted Lila, no visitor had been seen climbing to the cabin. Once again, suspicion fell back on the same unspoken conclusion. In June 1946, the 5th child came, a girl, Sarah. Unlike her siblings, Sarah appeared strong, her cry sharp, her features more balanced. Her eyes, deep, startling blue, were so identical to Silas's that even townsfolk who saw her years later would remark on it. Silas, who rarely showed affection to anyone, seemed almost proud of Sarah. He took her into town on errands, parading her in front of others as though she were proof of redemption. Smart little thing, he would boast to the grocer, a disturbing pride that made others uncomfortable. This pride was not merely personal, it was symbolic. In the harsh calculus of genetics, Sarah represented a child who had slipped through the cracks, carrying enough resilience to mask the damage of her lineage. For Lila, Sarah's health was a fragile hope that perhaps the cycle might not always end in tragedy. For Silas, it was something darker, confirmation that what he had built inside the cabin could endure, that his bloodline had not been extinguished by deformity or death. As Sarah reached school age, she began to attend classes sporadically in the warmer months. Her teacher, Miss Claire Donnelly, noticed the contrast immediately. Sarah struggled at times, but she was far more advanced than Ruthie, whose simple crafts and repetitive speech left her far behind her peers. Donnelly also noticed something else. Sarah's bruises, the fear in her eyes, the way she spoke too carefully about Daddy. These were warning signs, but in the 1,942nd teachers had little authority to intervene, especially in isolated communities where the sheriff himself often turned a blind eye. By the close of the 1,942nd, the Whitlow family had become a study in contrasts. Behind their cabin doors were graves of lost infants, a daughter with a fragile mind, and a mother carrying burdens too heavy for one lifetime. Yet there was also Sarah, seemingly stronger, brighter, a child who gave the illusion that not all was broken. The valley held its silence. The neighbors kept their distance, and Silas continued to rule his household with the cold authority of a man convinced he was untouchable. But beneath the silence, tension simmered. Each birth and each grave etched deeper scars into the land and the people who lived upon it. The Whitlow's story was no longer just rumor, it was becoming legend. a whispered tale of how isolation twists into tragedy and how love can be both salvation and curse when it grows in soil poisoned by secrecy. The winter of 1952 came earlier than anyone in Raven Hollow could remember. The first snows fell in October thick and heavy, and by December the mountain road was buried beneath layers of ice that turned even the hardiest mule teams back. For the Whitlow family, this isolation was nothing new. But this particular season, the silence pressing in on the cabin carried a different kind of weight, one that would soon end in both revelation and release. By then, Sarah, the youngest of Lila's surviving children, had begun to attend school on warmer days. Her teacher, Miss Claire Donnelly, quickly grew concerned. One dreary autumn morning, Sarah arrived with a dark bruise across her cheek. When pressed gently, she offered words that chilled her teacher more than the winds outside. Daddy got angry because Mommy didn't want to sleep in his bed anymore. He says she always has to because she's his. Miss Donnelly, shaken, reported the matter to Sheriff Amos Ridley. But Ridley was an old mountain man, slow to move, cautious of meddling in what he considered family matters. His response was dismissive. "These hollers have their own customs, Miss Donnelly. Unless there's clear danger, it ain't our role to interfere." In truth, his reluctance masked fear. Everyone in the valley knew Silas Whitlow's reputation: proud, volatile, a man whose glare alone could end conversations. Still, the bruise on Sarah's face lingered in Donnelly's mind, long after the sheriff's words faded. That winter proved unforgiving. Coal was scarce, food scarcer, and sickness swept through the valleys like a shadow. In January 1953, as blizzards raged outside, the people of Raven Hollow noticed something peculiar. Silas no longer appeared in town, not even when the thaw began. For months, no one spoke his name aloud, though the questions burned unasked. It was not until July that the mystery broke open. A hunter named Joseph Miller, lost while tracking deer, stumbled near the Whitlow property. Passing by the family cemetery behind the cabin, he spotted a fresh grave. The crude wooden marker bore a name carved roughly into its surface: Silas Whitlow, the 12th of January 1953. Miller froze. It was strange enough that no one in town had been told of Silas's death. Stranger still, that the family had buried him alone in winter without seeking help. More unsettling, as Miller crept near the cabin window, he glimpsed something unexpected: Lila sitting at the table with Sarah and Ruthie, a faint smile on her face. She looked, if only for a moment, free. News of the discovery reached Sheriff Ridley, who trudged up the mountain to confirm. There it was, the grave, the marker, the silence of the cabin. Lila met him at the door, calm but guarded. "He got sick," she explained. "Pneumonia. Wouldn't see a doctor. One morning he just didn't wake up." Her words were plain, but Ridley thought he detected something behind them: a hesitation, a relief too deep to hide completely. Yet without evidence of wrongdoing, he had no grounds to press further. The case was closed before it even opened. Silas Whitlow was gone, buried beneath the frozen earth he had ruled for decades. What followed was a transformation few could have predicted. With Silas gone, the cabin itself seemed to breathe differently. Windows that had once been shuttered were opened to let in sunlight. Lila planted a small garden near the clearing, coaxing beans and squash from the soil. Sarah returned to school regularly, her face brightening under Miss Donnelly's encouragement. Even Ruthie, though still limited in her development, grew calmer, her nervous tics softening into quiet routines of sewing and humming. For the first time, the Whitlow home showed signs of life, unshackled from fear. It was during this period of fragile rebirth that Thomas Avery entered their lives. A widowed carpenter who had moved to McDowell County after losing his wife. Thomas was known for his steady hands and gentle manner. He first encountered Lila at the general store, where she stood uncertainly in line with Sarah, tugging at her sleeve. He offered to help carry her supplies, and though she declined, something in her eyes, wary, tired, but curious, stayed with him. Over the months that followed, their paths crossed again and again. At church gatherings, in the dusty aisles of the store on the road that led toward the hollow, Thomas was patient, never pressing, content with small conversations about weather harvests or tools. But his interest did not go unnoticed. The town, ever eager for gossip, buzzed with speculation. "How can a decent man like Avery involve himself with her?" muttered some. Others warned him outright. "You know who fathered those girls, don't you? You're walking into a cursed family." One Sunday afternoon, after a church service, the whispers finally reached his ears in plain speech. Clementine Parker, an older woman with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, cornered him in the parking lot. "Martha, Lila never had a husband. Those children, their father was the same man who raised her. Silas kept his own daughter, and you best understand what that means. The words struck Thomas like a blow. He drove aimlessly along the mountain roads that evening, struggling to reconcile what he had heard with the woman he had come to admire from afar. Finally, unable to resist the pull of truth, he steered his wagon toward the Whitlow cabin. Lila sat on the porch, as though expecting him, her posture weary but steady. When he approached, she looked him directly in the eye for the first time. "You found out, didn't you?" she said quietly. Thomas nodded, his voice failing him. She continued, her tone both resigned and defiant. "I know what people say. I know what they think of me. But before you walk away, I want you to hear my story from my own lips." That night, beneath a canopy of stars, Lila recounted her life, the loss of her mother, the growing control of her father, the punishments when she tried to escape, at 14 the years of silence, the births and the burials. She spoke without embellishment, her words raw but steady. For Thomas, listening was both unbearable and necessary. Each detail painted a portrait not of scandal but of survival, of a woman who had endured unthinkable cruelty and yet somehow remained alive, protective of her children, desperate for a shred of freedom. When she finished, silence hung between them, broken only by the creek murmuring below. Thomas reached for her hands, rough from years of labor, trembling from years of fear. "No one should bear what you've borne," he said at last. "No one." For the first time in decades, Lila allowed herself to believe that perhaps life might hold something beyond the shadow of her father's control. Silas lay in the earth, his reign ended. In his absence, new possibilities stirred, fragile, uncertain, but real. The valley that had once echoed with silence now carried the faintest sound of change. The months following Silas Whitlow's death were a fragile reprieve for Lila. For the first time in decades, she was not under his gaze, not trapped beneath the weight of his rules. She could breathe, if only cautiously. Yet freedom did not erase the scars carved into her spirit. Even in sleep, the old chains rattled. Night after night she woke, trembling, convinced she saw her father standing in the corner of her room, or lurking just beyond the cabin's doorway. It was Thomas Avery who gently suggested she might seek help. At first, Lila resisted the notion. "I don't need a doctor for my mind," she told him firmly, fearing judgment and ridicule. In 1952nd Appalachia, talk of psychiatry carried heavy stigma. To many it was seen as weakness, even madness. But Thomas persisted with quiet patience. Eventually, when the nightmares began to interfere with her ability to care for Sarah and Ruthie, she relented. That summer, Thomas arranged for her to meet Dr. Everett Lang, a psychiatrist who traveled monthly from Charleston to the larger towns in the county. Dr. Lang was an unusually progressive man for his time, trained in the new field of trauma psychology. Where others might have seen sin or moral failing, he saw a human being crushed by prolonged abuse. He listened as Lila spoke haltingly of her father, her lost children, her silence. "You survived in the only ways you could," he told her. "That does not make you guilty. It makes you alive." The sessions were painful. Some days Lila left his office trembling, unable to speak. Other days she walked out lighter, as though the act of speaking had loosened chains she hadn't known, still bound her. Slowly she began to recognize that her fears, her shame, her grief were not curses but consequences, natural responses to years of control and violation. For the first time she began to call what had happened to her by its true name: abuse. Naming the wound was not healing it, but it was the first step toward reclaiming her life. In the cabin, life pressed on. Sarah, bright-eyed and restless, was thriving in school. She was curious, stubborn, often asking questions that startled her mother. "Why don't I have a father like the other children?" she asked one evening, her small hands clutching a doll made from scraps of cloth. Lila froze her breath, catching, "Your grandfather took care of us when your father left." She managed choosing words carefully, though even as they left her mouth she knew the answer was a half-truth at best. Sarah's eyes narrowed with a child's instinctive suspicion, but she let the matter rest for then. Ruthie, by contrast, remained in her own quiet world. She found joy in sewing and repetitive patterns, her small creations surprising in their beauty. Her quilts, pieced together from rags and old clothing, carried a strange artistry, like maps of memory stitched into fabric. Though she struggled with speech and comprehension, her hands spoke fluently through thread and needle. For Lila, Ruthie was both burden and blessing, a constant reminder of the price of her father's choices, and yet a living soul whose presence softened the harshness of their days. But the fragile balance shattered in 1959 when Sarah, now 13, stumbled upon a box hidden in the attic. Inside lay a diary, its pages yellowed with time, filled with her mother's handwriting. Sarah read in silence, tears dripping onto the ink. There it was, in blunt words, the truth of her birth, the secret she had always sensed but never dared imagine. Her grandfather was also her father. The children buried behind the cabin were her siblings. The whispers in town were not lies, they were echoes of a reality too unbearable to name. When Lila found Sarah sitting on the bed with the diary open, she knew instantly what had happened. The glass of water in her hand nearly slipped. Sarah's voice, when it came, was small but devastating. "Is it true? Was Grandpa? Was he my father?" For a long moment, Lila could not answer. She wanted to deny it to shield her daughter from the horror, but lies had already poisoned too much of their lives. Finally, she whispered the word that broke them both: yes. Sarah withdrew into herself after that day. She stopped attending school, afraid her classmates could see the truth etched onto her face. "I'm a freak," she sobbed one night. "Half of me comes from the same place. Is that why Ruthie is the way she is? Is that why my brothers died? What's wrong with me that we just haven't seen yet?" Lila held her, desperate to undo her pain, but explanations failed her. It was Thomas who proposed, seeking help beyond the hollow. Through his contacts, he arranged a meeting with Dr. Miriam Halpern, a university geneticist in Pennsylvania, known for her pioneering work on human heredity. After exchanging letters, the family made the long journey east. Dr. Halpern examined Sarah with a mixture of compassion and clinical precision. She explained genetics not as a curse, but as a pattern of inheritance. Every human carried recessive genes that, when paired with similar ones, could cause illness. In isolated populations, especially where close kin married, the risks multiplied. But she emphasized Sarah herself showed resilience. "If you marry outside your bloodline, your children will likely be as healthy as any others," she said firmly. "You are not doomed by your beginnings. You are not a freak. You are a young woman with choices." For Sarah, these words were a lifeline. Though the truth of her origins remained heavy, she began to separate that truth from her identity. She was not simply the daughter of incest. She was Sarah Avery, having taken Thomas's surname when he formally joined their household. She was a student, a sister, a girl with dreams yet unshaped. The visit to Dr. Halpern marked a turning point. For the first time, Sarah glimpsed a future not defined by her grandfather's shadow. Yet healing was not linear. Lila still woke at night in sweat, seeing Silas in every dark corner. Sarah's confidence waxed and waned, her anger sometimes spilling out in sharp words. Ruthie's health was fragile, her heart murmur worrying the doctor. And Thomas, steadfast though he was, bore the strain of carrying a family's trauma that was not his own. Still, something had shifted. The silence was broken. The wounds were named, and in naming them, the Whitlows, now the Averys, began the long, painful work of reclaiming their lives from the man who had stolen so much. In Raven Hollow, the cabin still stood, but its meaning had changed. It was no longer just a prison of secrets. It was now also a place where those secrets had been spoken aloud, where children could learn that their story did not have to be their fate. By the early 1962nd, the Whitlow story seemed to many in Raven Hollow like a ghost that might finally fade. Yet for Sarah Avery, now in her mid-teens, the past pressed hard against the present. She bore the knowledge of her origins like a stone in her chest, heavy and unyielding. And yet, despite everything, she was determined to shape a future different from the one carved out for her mother. In 1962, Sarah met Michael Prescott, the son of a university professor who had come to McDowell County to study Appalachian ballads and folk traditions. Michael was everything. Sarah was not used to educated, inquisitive, and unafraid to ask questions that others avoided. Their friendship began in the most ordinary way, swapping stories about local songs at a church picnic. But beneath their words, a deeper bond formed, one built not on secrets but on trust. Sarah wrestled with when to reveal her family's truth. Fear gnawed at her. What if Michael recoiled? What if he saw her as tainted, as cursed? One evening, sitting beneath the skeletal branches of a sycamore tree, she finally confessed. She told him haltingly about Silas, about her siblings' graves, about the whispers that still clung to her name. When she finished, she could barely meet his eyes. Michael was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "My father's family fled Russia because they were Jews. They were hunted, hated, reduced to nothing but what others said they were. I know what it's like to carry a story you didn't choose." His words did not erase Sarah's pain, but they gave her something she had never had before: acceptance. Sarah's determination soon bore fruit. In 1963, she earned a scholarship to study nursing at West Virginia University. For a girl from Raven Hollow, such an achievement was almost unheard of. Lila wept when she received the letter, clutching Sarah's hands as if afraid to let go. "You're going to see a world I never could," she whispered. For Lila, Sarah's success was more than personal triumph. It was proof that the cycle could break, that the shadow of Silas did not stretch forever. Back in Raven Hollow, Ruthie had found her own kind of purpose. Though her mind remained childlike, her hands worked with a genius that astonished those who saw her creations. Quilts, tapestries, and embroidered panels flowed from her fingers, each piece telling a story in color and thread. Church bazaars began to sell her work, and her reputation quietly spread. People who had once whispered about the cursed Whitlows now admired Ruthie's craft, even if they never said it aloud. Lila herself continued to meet with Dr. Everett Lang, who encouraged her to share her experiences in a way that might help others. At first, she resisted, fearing exposure and ridicule, but Lang reminded her, "Silence is what allowed your father to control you. Voice is what frees you." By the late 1962, she agreed to let her story under the pseudonym Patient L be included in a study on survivors of prolonged familial abuse. The paper, circulated in medical and psychological circles, became one of the most cited early accounts in the growing field of trauma research. Lila never saw the academic recognition it received, but she did feel the quiet satisfaction of knowing her pain was no longer only her own. It was a lantern for others stumbling in the dark. In 1965, Sarah, now in her final year of nursing school, married Michael in a modest chapel ceremony. The aisle was narrow, the congregation small, but to Lila, it was as grand as a cathedral. Watching her daughter walk forward in a simple white dress flanked by friends she had chosen, Lila felt the weight of decades begin to lift. Here was proof that love could be chosen freely, without coercion, without chains. After the ceremony, Thomas Avery, now husband in all but name, took Lila's hands. "You see," he said softly, "the line is breaking." Lila, tears in her eyes, nodded. For the first time, she dared to believe him. The years that followed were not without sorrow. In 1970, Ruthie died suddenly at age 29, her weak heart giving out in the night. The news devastated Lila, who had always feared that Ruthie's body carried too much of the Whitlow curse. Yet at the funeral, surrounded by Ruthie's quilts and tapestries, Lila felt a different truth. Ruthie had left behind beauty, not just tragedy. Her work lived on, her patterns stitched into the very fabric of the community. Sarah, now a mother herself, returned with her 2 children, Elizabeth and James. Watching them play in the meadow outside the cabin, the same meadow where Silas had once stalked her, Lila felt a profound shift. These children were healthy, joyful, free. The line of pain had been interrupted, broken by choice, by knowledge, by courage. But memory has a way of resurfacing. Some nights, Lila still woke in terror, seeing Silas's face in the shadows. Other nights, Sarah herself struggled with doubt, wondering if her children would someday bear the unseen weight of her bloodline. To steady themselves, mother and daughter turned to one another. They spoke openly, refusing the silence that had once smothered them. In these conversations, a theme emerged: legacy. What did it mean to carry a legacy of harm? Could it truly be broken, or was it only transformed into something new? For Lila, the answer came slowly. She realized that every choice Sarah made, every stitch Ruthie had sewn, every kindness Thomas had shown was a thread woven against the old pattern. The tapestry of their lives was no longer defined solely by Silas. It carried his shadow, yes, but it also carried light. By the mid-1972, Sarah's children grew strong, and her career in nursing flourished. Michael supported her fiercely, never letting her forget her worth. Lila, though aged beyond her years, found moments of peace in her garden, tending beans and squash under the Sunday. Sometimes she would pause, look at the cabin behind her, and whisper aloud, "We broke it. You don't own us anymore." The cabin, once a prison, had become a witness to transformation. Its walls had heard screams, but now they heard laughter. Its floors had known chains, but now they felt the patter of grandchildren's feet. The graves behind it remained silent, reminders of what had been. Yet even they seemed different now, not just markers of tragedy, but proof that survival was possible, that life continued, that the line had been broken. In Raven Hollow, the story of the Whitlows still lingered in whispers, but within the Avery family the story had shifted. It was no longer simply about horror. It was about endurance, about naming wounds and refusing to let them define the future. And in that refusal lay the true break in the bloodline, a choice to end the cycle and begin again. The cabin in Raven Hollow stands no more. Its timbers, once echoing with silence and sorrow, have long since sagged into the earth, swallowed by moss and time. The small family cemetery still rests at the edge of the clearing, wooden markers, weathered, some tilting, others broken, but the wind that moves through the pines carries a different sound now, not secrecy but memory. For Lila, the years after Ruthie's death were a gradual surrender. She aged quickly, her hair silver, her hands gnarled, yet her eyes softened. She lived long enough to see her grandchildren grow strong, to watch Sarah's life unfold in ways she had once believed impossible. When Lila passed in 1985, she left not only her quilts and journals, but also a legacy of courage. The decision to name what had been done to her, to refuse silence, and to allow the next generation to live unshackled. The lesson of Raven Hollow is stark but necessary. Isolation can breed silence, and silence can breed tragedy. But even the darkest inheritance can be broken, not erased, never forgotten but transformed. Knowledge, compassion, and the refusal to hide are what turn curses into stories of survival. As the sun dips behind the ridges, casting the valley in gold, one truth remains: the sins of the fathers need not chain the children. In speaking aloud, in choosing differently, in daring to love freely, a bloodline once poisoned by secrecy was redirected toward hope. Before you go, pause for a moment. Share your thoughts in the comments. What do you take from this story, and how do you think silence shapes the families around us? Every reflection adds to the chorus of voices that ensure such stories are never buried again.